Welcome back to another episode of Practice Underwater. This is George Hariri from the Shared Practices, and I'm here with nobody. So this is probably the oddest Practice Underwater I've ever recorded. So I got to give you guys kind of an update here. So this is Nesto. Our guest is Nesto, but Nesto is not here. So Nesto and I got to know each other in the Mastermind. So Nesto is one of the dentists who's in the Ask George Mastermind. And Nesto and I kind of touched base on the location growth call for the first time. Nesto has two practices, and one practice is making money, the other practice is losing money, and so it's a very interesting situation. And so, I told Nesto there's like these three options how I would approach the situation. We have a Slack channel for the mastermind, so I gave him some advice in the Slack channel after the call, and then I found myself really compelled to do more. And so we've been, reviving Practice Underwater. I didn't do it for 4 years. And then I started coming back on, and we had Gregorio on, and it was a great episode. Gregorio is also in the Ask George Mastermind. Actually, I just got an image of his floor plan the other day. And, it's been a ton of fun, but I had Nesto on, and so Nesto and I recorded part 1 and part 2 of Practice Underwater together. So he was here with me for part 1. We recorded the whole episode, and then we had a technical issue where the audio didn't record. And this happens every once in a while. Like we had, a doctor who flew to do a TV segment, didn't record. It happens. It's part of production at times. Things don't record. So then today, Nesto and I re-recorded part 1, and then again, it did not record. And so poor Nesto, he's been on Shared Practices 2 times now for the part 1, and then he already did a part 2. So Nesto has recorded 3 episodes with us, and none of them have recorded. So I told Nesto, I said, look, Nesto, we're going to sort this out, and we'll get you back on for part 2. But at this point, I just got to record part 1. So part 1 is going to be me telling Nesto's story, which is definitely unconventional, but I think that I've recorded it twice now. So I feel like this will be my 3rd time, and third time's a charm. And also I know the story very well. And I'm just going to tell you guys Nesto's story for part 1 and kind of walk through the whole situation, provide the guidance, teach the things that there are to teach in this. And then we'll kind of be back for part 2. So, Nesto, like I said, he came to me in the Ask George Mastermind, and he has these 2 practices, one practice where he's making money, the other practice where he's losing money. And, he has an associate, and so he works 2 days a week at each office. So he works a total of 4 days a week, 2 at each practice. And then he also has his associate working 2 days a week at each practice. And so between the 2 of them, we're kind of going back and forth, and each office is open for 4 days. And so, that's a very unconventional situation. And so I asked Nesto, I said, how did you get into this, owning of 2 practices, one that's losing money, the other one that's not? Typically, what would happen in a situation like this, and it's very common, where a dentist themselves owns the practice, and they own the first office, like the busier practice, and things are going really well. And then they're like, oh, this is going so well, I want 2 of these. So then they go buy a second practice, a satellite or something like that. And then it doesn't go as well. Things are harder. They start to realize that what happened at the first practice wasn't as repeatable as they had thought. And then they end up in a situation where they have one practice making money, the other practice losing money. So Nesto's situation, that's like the traditional way that a dentist ends up in this, kind of dynamic where they have 2 practices. One's a cash generator, the other one's a cash loss. And in this situation, it was actually different. So Nesto, almost 3 years ago now, so in the summer of 2022, Nesto had a business partner, and they were friends from dental school. And this individual, seems like they had kind of an amicable break, but they were business partners. And Nesto and his business partner, they were acquiring a first practice. So I'm just going to tell you the story. So Nesto and his business partner were acquiring a first practice, and this first practice was doing collections of around $690,000. So if you think of the average practice in the United States, it's kind of right there. But this was an untraditional $690,000 in that it was like low volume and high fee procedures. So a lot of full mouth rehab, all on 4, essentially very high ticket cases for the number of patients that were there. And there was actually only 1 hygiene day per week of hygiene flow, and the hygienist who was working there was only working one day. So there weren't a lot of patients. Practice, like I said, previous collections were about 690,000 per year, and the purchase price was 475,000. And so I asked Nesto, I'm like, what was appealing about this practice to you guys? And Nesto talked about how the area is favorable, and there's a lot of new development in this part of the country. And so Nesto and his business partner, their plan was to acquire this first practice, and they were thinking that they would each maybe work at it 2 days per week, and then they would keep part-time associateships. So kind of in Nesto's mind, him and his business partner would both be kind of growing this practice and eventually get to the second office. And in this situation, as they were in the process of doing diligence, which I just kind of want to put an aside in this. And I every single time I've recorded with Nesto, the first time, the second time, and now during this episode where Nesto's not here, I'm I'm going to take a minute and say, because the very first time when we were talking on the Ask George Mastermind, Nesto talked about how this particular practice would not fit the sort of BRS, buyer's representation services, that we provide at Shared Practice. Like, we would not recommend buying this office. And I want to just explain why. Because I think it's important. And, it's always tough when you have practice underwater because, Nesto in this situation owns the practice. And, so it's not like, it's not a very fun conversation to have to talk about, maybe why you should not have purchased the practice that you ended up purchasing. But that being said, Nesto has been very open-minded and very relaxed and kind of just, he has a great attitude in general. And you'll see that when he comes on in part 2. But the reason why you would not want to buy this practice is because this practice only has one hygiene day per week of patient flow. And so our whole philosophy is all about, patient flow leads to a predictable amount of revenue. And in this practice, the patient flow would say that there shouldn't be $690,000 of revenue. And the reason why there's not is because of the high ticket procedures that are being done here. And, if we had done a buyer's representation, we would have looked at the patient base size, we would have looked at the amount of hygiene days, and we would have looked at the procedure mix, and we would have looked at the buyers, and we would have said, you guys can't replicate these procedures. So the collections is going to decline post close. And that's exactly what happened. So this practice, in 2023, this practice, he historically was doing 690. In 2023, the practice did 310. And in 2024, the practice did about 338. So the practice, really more than halved, and then is now kind of at about half of its original collections. And that was because of the fact that the buyers weren't able to replicate the procedures that the seller was doing. And so the one hygiene day per week doesn't have enough dentistry in it to really do 690,000 without doing all on 4 and full mouth rehab and those types of procedures. And so, this was just a practice that probably wasn't a great acquisition opportunity. But however, that being said, Nesto and his partner decided to move forward. And so they're in diligence for this practice, and they're in the process of buying it. And then the broker comes to them and says, I actually have a second opportunity for you. I have an opportunity that has a very motivated sellers, and this practice is more expensive. So for the first practice, they paid $475,000 for a practice doing $690,000 in collections. And this practice was $100,000 higher on both accounts. It was $100,000 higher on the collections, $790,000, and it was also $100,000 higher on the purchase price, $575,000. But it had 7 days of hygiene. So using the Shared Practices Buyer's Representation school of thought, we like to look at patient flow, and we like to get practices that are ready to grow. And so this second practice actually really kind of would be one that we would thumbs up because of the 7 hygiene days per week. And, now fast forward to today, this is Nesto's cash generating busy practice where they do over $1 million a year, like almost 1.1 in the last 12 months at this practice. And so it's grown post acquisition, and, it's been a good opportunity. So, they ended up closing on these 2 practices, June of 22, July of 22, like literally 1 month apart between the 2. And for that first year, Nesto and his business partner were going back and forth between the 2 practices, working 2 days a week each. So Nesto would work 2 days a week at the slower practice, then he would work 2 days a week at the busier practice. Nesto's business partner would do 2 days a week at the slower practice, 2 days a week at the busier practice, and that was kind of what they would be doing. And, very quickly, Nesto talks about how the partnership started to kind of show signs of not working. They both showed up differently with staff. They both showed up differently with patients. They both had very different leadership styles, and those things were starting to clash. And so throughout that first year, it was becoming apparent that this partnership wasn't going to succeed long term. And it kind of came to a head around the 1 year mark. And Nesto and his business partner, they asked themselves some questions. They said, okay, well, we probably should not be working together. And so there was a few options. They could each take one practice, which would then open up the question of who takes the busier practice and who takes the slower practice. And Nesto is just so open-minded. Nesto was fine with either option. Nesto would say he'd go to the slower practice. He'd also go to the busier practice. And Nesto also kind of talked about how, potentially one of them would walk away entirely and the other one would take both offices. And what ended up happening, according to Nesto, is that Nesto's business partner said that either office wasn't really for him. And so that Nesto gladly took both offices. And so then for the next year, Nesto was working 2 days a week at each practice, but there was no other dentist. So it was just Nesto. So one dentist going between two offices. One's a busier practice, one's a slower practice. One, 7 hygiene days per week, one's 1 hygiene day per week. And Nesto called this year very challenging because during this year, you think of the burnout, right? He's doing 2 dentists worth of work. He has 2 teams, and both teams, there was pressure there, right? They all worked 4 days per week. So Nesto had 2 different teams, each employed 4 days per week, going between both offices, working 4 days a week himself. And, I found Nesto to be in in my 3 episodes with him that none of them have recorded. I found Nesto to be a great leader. I think he has a strong empathy for his team, and it really comes through in how he handled this year. So during this year, Nesto, was working at both practices and, he kept his teams working 4 days a week, right? He told them, look, you guys keep working your hours. You guys have your paychecks to be relatively the same. And I'll be the one to sacrifice where I'll work 2 days a week at each office. And that was really how Nesto proceeded. And then at a point, about a year later, so now we're 2 years post-acquisition, 1 year with the partnership, 1 year with Nesto going between 2 offices, Nesto brought on an associate. And the associate then kind of filled in the old role of going 2 days a week at each practice. And that was when things started changing materially for Nesto, where before Nesto's stress was time stress, like the fact that, especially when you go to the busier practice, you're there 2 days a week, like you're just busy all day, you're the only doctor, that's just a lot of stress. And, that stress transformed to financial stress. Well, now there's an abundance of doctors, but what there is not is an abundance of time or, cash flow. So what happened is when Nesto brought on the second provider, the cash flow dynamics of this group began to break. So that's when, the associate started June of 2024 and has been with him today up until now. We're recording in April of 2025. So, when I look through Nesto's analytics, one thing that I notice from looking through there is that the associate is less productive per patient than Nesto. So what happened is when the associate came on, the associate was less productive. So for the same number of patients, maybe there's less productivity, but there's also more expenses associated with having an associate there. And so now what happened is, there is the busier practice now is profitable but less profitable. And the slower practice went from maybe breaking even, where Nesto was essentially donating his time for free, to Nesto working 2 days a week at that practice, and it's still losing money. So then the profits funnel from the good practice to the practice where, it's losing money, right? I don't want to call it the bad practice, but it's the practice that there's losses. So when I looked at the financials for the previous year, to kind of put things in perspective. So with the associate there and all that we kind of had going on there, About $80,000 per year is the loss at the second practice. And, that's about half of the income of the busy office. So the busy office pays Nesto a modest salary. So he's not making what he would make as an associate. So Nesto is producing a healthy amount and making, like a hygienist's pay. Let's kind of put it that way. And, just a modest salary, pay his bills, and is working really hard, but the profits from the busy office are going to pay, the office that's losing money. And so this was the situation that Nesto really brought to me in the mastermind. And so I told Nesto, I said, well, I see three choices. I see choice one, swallow your medicine, take your medicine, and sell the practice it's a distressed asset at this point, right? There's a lot of debt on the office because the purchase price was $475, but the collections are $340 in the last 12 months. So, there's, potentially you sell the slower practice at a loss, just focus on the busier practice. That was option one. And something that Nesto didn't tell me the first couple of times we talked about it, but the bank actually offered. So normally this option is very challenging because when you take this option, really what you're doing is you're selling the practice at a loss. Let's just say you get $250,000 out of the practice. You might have $150,000 to $200,000 left on your note after that $250,000 goes to the bank. Well, I thought Nesto would be responsible for paying that up front. But since the same bank had the loan for both offices, that bank offered to transfer that debt to the original busy practice. So essentially, Nesto would just have a bigger loan at the busier practice and would get out of the slower practice, which I actually think, I think all things being considered, that is a very viable option. And I think one thing that people don't particularly like about an option like that is it requires you, I call it take your medicine, right? But it requires you to accept a sunk cost. And it requires you to accept that this didn't work and essentially lock in a long-term financial consequence because of that, right? So Nesto was saying that would increase his practice month payment by about $2,000 per month. So for 13 years, Nesto would have to pay an extra $2,000 per month, something like that, as his form of medicine in this situation, right? So I think that scenario, that's a good option, to get out of this situation and to get into a healthier situation where you're working at the same office 4 days a week. It's doing over $1 million a year. You're the only dentist. Like you can make, 400,000 or so, and then you have, some debt that you're paying off for something that didn't work, right? I don't think that's a bad outcome, but it's not what Nesto wants. And one thing that we'll talk about is, this calendar year, things are picking up a little bit at that slower practice. And so, that's part of the reason why Nesto is not so interested in this. Nesto really wants to kind of grind it out. And so the second option is so that was the first option. First option, sell the slower practice, go just have one practice again. And, we've talked about that. Nesto doesn't want to do that. And so the second option is to consolidate the offices. So close down the slower practice, have all the patients and team members all live in one practice, which is the busier practice. And that doesn't work because these practices are about 45 minutes apart in a suburban area. So you think of like a suburban, kind of outside of a city, like 45 minutes, patients aren't going to drive that. Patients are just going to find a new provider. And, staff, team members, I think for one team member, I actually, on part 2 of the first take, I asked, can you have an assistant go from office 2 to office 1? And it turns out she did that one day, and it was an hour and 20 minutes each way. So staff aren't really going to go from practice 2 to practice 1. And so consolidating the offices isn't really an option either. So option 3, and I told Nesto in the mastermind call the very first time we talked about this, I told Nesto, I said, only proceed with the option of keeping them both, which is option 3, if you see an end in sight to this situation, right? As in, like, do you see a quick something that can be done or some type of bottleneck that you can address, like some short term in 12 months, get yourself out of this situation option, then proceed with option 3. And option 3 is keeping both practices, being patient with the second office that's losing money and trying to turn it around to the point where it's a break even. And getting this to a break even, like that's a big milestone in this journey, because once you get this to break even, then you now have a situation that is remarkably more sustainable, right? You have a practice, a busy practice that's generating cash. You now have a second practice that is no longer losing that cash. It's not necessarily, you're still working for free, you're still not having income. It's not great, right? But it's remarkably better than losing money. So, getting it to break even essentially buys you patience where you can then wait and get it to profitability. And so, Nesto in this situation, Nesto gravitates towards that. And the reason why Nesto gravitates towards that is Nesto's long-term vision is very focused on having two practices with, I think Nesto thinks that, the busy practice, I think, is showing it could potentially be one day a two-doctor office, right? So it's doing over $1 million right now. It has over 1,200 patients, right? If you continue to grow the patient pool of this practice, it could continue to grow, and it could potentially be a practice that has two full-time dentists working there. And so Nesto really wants to set up a situation where both of these practices are doing well long-term, and Nesto can go back and forth between the two of them, working ideally one day a week at each office doing higher ticket procedures. And so, Nesto does a fair amount of dentistry. So Nesto does a lot of endo. Nesto does implants, Invisalign, some TMD, sleep apnea, and, obviously bread and butter as well. And so, Nesto that's part of the reason why Nesto is more productive than his associate, because he does kind of those higher ticket procedures as well, and it's sprinkled into his mix. And so Nesto really wants to get to the point, and that's where I think it's really important. Anytime you're an owner operator, you get the opportunity to exert your vision on your enterprise. And so in this situation, Nesto has two practices, and Nesto gets to exert his vision on this group, which is to have two locations that each have a dentist or two working. Each of them are profitable with those providers and with that setup. And then Nesto goes in and, works a lighter schedule between the two offices, doing higher dollar procedures and, having an income from the practice with the associates, and then also taking in a large percentage of his own production due to the fact that the costs are covered by the regular operations with the associate. So, that's kind of like the pseudo-specialist setup that we talk about. And, that's something that Nesto is very drawn to. So in this situation, right, Nesto, and this is the thing I really admire about Nesto, is he has this ability to just kind of stick it out in what is not a pleasant situation, right? And he's talked about the personal financial stress being the hardest part about the current situation. But really, for his entire experience of ownership, it's been a different version of an issue, right? The first year, it was a partnership challenge. The second year, it was partnership breakup and kind of like picking up the pieces from that, where you're going between two practices, and, you're doing that. And then year 3 is the associate and the financial stress, right? But each year it was partnership stress, then it was time and management stress, and then it was financial stress. But, I think that Nesto described his story as a grittier one. And I would really agree with that assessment, and especially that word gritty. I think of Nesto and here, and I just think it's very gritty. And I think Nesto, in all of this, has remained grounded in Nesto's vision, which is, I want these two practices long term. I want to, ultimately have two practices. I like these offices. I like the teams. He believes that he can ramp up the slower practice. He still believes it's in a favorable area with new development, and, wants to have that life of two practices and have, a high income doing high value procedures with, two sets of maybe one associate at each office, maybe two associates at the busy practice, one associate at the not busy practice. But that's really where Nesto wants to go. And I think that, for me, looking at the situation, I would just say rationally, I would just leave the slower practice, take option 1, and, really proceed down that road. And, but at the end of the day, I think one thing that we like to do at shared practices, we really like to listen to the owner operator and their vision, right? Their vision sets the tone for what we do. And so Nesto's vision is very clear. I want to have the two practices. I want to do high value procedures. I want to be the pseudo-specialist, and I'm willing to grit it out in the situation. And, you tip your hat to somebody who has that attitude in this type of situation. So now I think to kind of close, I want to introduce kind of the mindset heading into part two. So part two, this is how I'm looking at the situation. So, you know, in this episode, it's actually different because I'm narrating the whole story. But in the first episode, as I was listening to Nesto talking about this, I'm asking a lot of questions. I'm kind of poking around, trying to see what's there. I was even asking him questions like, how does the money transfer? Because I was actually wondering, like, does he transfer the money himself, like 5,000, 10,000, whatever is needed to kind of cover the expense of the second practice? Because that would be very painful. Like every time you transfer the money, it's going to be an unpleasant experience. And, in this situation, his accountant does it. So I was asking all of these different questions to kind of arrive at the very succinct story that I was able to tell you on this episode. And the one thing that really kept coming at me, I'm like, okay, every way I've pushed, Nesto is very adamant that he wants both offices. I mean, even from when the partnership was splitting up, Nesto wanted both offices. And today, Nesto still wants both offices, when I would think you should probably, just cut down to one. Take your medicine, the 13-year payment of $2,000 a month, go back, simple life, one practice, like just go back. And no, Nesto's very clear on his vision. And so, then I'm like, okay, we're going to keep both offices. Then I look at, okay, what's the bottleneck in the second practice? Like, why is it not growing? What is going on? Well, it was acquired at one hygiene day per week. So it's a patient flow problem, right? And if you look at the patient base size, the patient base in practice 2 is a third of the patient base in practice 1. And the collections, it follows that exact same ratio. So the collections in practice 1 is 3 times higher than practice 2 because the patient base is 3 times bigger. It's in our philosophy, we've learned there's just a very direct correlation between the number of patients you see and your top line collections production. So in this situation, it's just a patient base issue. So then there's an interesting note, and this is where we kind of end part 1 as we talk about this idea that, okay, we're going to proceed with 2 practices. I want to get out of the worst part of this problem as fast as possible. What is the worst part of this problem? The worst part of this problem is that practice 2 is taking away half of the profit of practice 1. So practice 1 is generating cash. That cash could be used for Nesto to live, but Nesto's been living on a modest salary. I mean, you just really feel for Nesto in terms of the personal life impact, right? Not expanding his lifestyle, keeping it very similar to probably, maybe very early after dental school. And, the cash generated in practice 1 could be used to enhance his lifestyle slightly. Or it could also be used to invest in practice 2 through increasing its patient base size, right? But in this situation, it's being used to fund the regular operations of a losing money location in practice 2. So that's what I would call the most painful situation right now, is that we have practice 2 sucking out half of the profit from practice 1. So when I look at this situation in order of priority number 1 by far is limit the bleed of practice 2. Right? We don't have a very quick and easy way to double the patient base size. So in the first quarter, I have Nesto's analytics up here. So in the first quarter, Nesto saw 55 new patients in the slower practice, right? So it's a little bit less than 20 new patients per month. So we're looking at a slow build of, you're adding 240 patients per year and you're not going to retain all of them, right? So we're looking at 2 to 3 years of that kind of momentum to get into a situation where you have enough patients for one full-time hygienist, and then the costs will start to even out a little bit more, right? And then you should be profitable at that type of number, right? So when you're looking at the bottleneck in practice 2 is the fact that there's not enough patients. And that, again, we can talk about it. There was a buyer's representation services kind of void in the fact that, this ownership situation was entered. But nonetheless, here we are. So from my perspective, I'm a CFO looking at this, right? I'm thinking cost cutting, right? I'm like, where can we cut the costs in practice number 2 to essentially minimize the amount of money it's bleeding every month? That's a really big objective, right? So, number 1, minimize the amount of money being lost in practice number 2. And, I have the profit and loss here, and you're going to see at the beginning of the second part when we have Nesto on air, and you guys can all meet Nesto. Nesto's awesome. Um, then you're going to see, like, we're going to talk through. I have a very key observation that I bring to part 2 that talks about how can we really drastically reduce the expenses here. And so I have that coming in part 2. And then the other thing that we're going to do, so number 1 priority, reduce expenses in practice 2, like find a way. Then objective number 2 is looking at the first practice. How can we increase the amount of cash we're generating in that first practice? And the solution that I come up with in part 2 is a singular change, which is relatively big, that could potentially do both. It can lower the amount of cash being lost in practice 2, and it can increase the amount of cash being generated in practice 1. And what that would allow for, because there's like, if you have a practice that's making money, that means you have a practice that's well beyond its break-even point in terms of its collections. So if you can increase the collections and the production on practice 1, you can do a lot for yourself by generating more cash flow to then be used to invest in the growth of the second practice's patient base. So realistically, that's how I see the kind of the financial workings that need to happen to get Nesto out of this situation. We need to reduce the amount of money we're losing in practice 2 so that we can open up the amount of money we have to invest in practice 1. We get more cash flowing through practice 1, and then we reinvest that strategically in practice 2 to grow the patient base. Like, that's how we get Nesto moving forward in this situation. And so when we come back for part 2, you're going to see I'm going to so the way that we did this, right? I told you, like, I've recorded this many times. You can see I was able to tell someone else's story. Like I have had this conversation multiple times. And so when we recorded part 2, Nesto and I went back and forth. I proposed this solution. He found it to be very abrupt, and he was worried about like the people dynamics of implementing it. So then we kind of negotiated through part 2, and we settled on like, okay, this is something that Nesto could do that would mostly address my concerns and reduce the expenses, but then also would be maybe more people tolerable for all of the people in Nesto's company that would he would need to tell them and get them on board and preserve culture and all of those things. And so, we'll come back and we'll start with part 2 there. And the first question I'm going to ask Nesto is, I'm just going to ask him, like, where are we at? How did it go? And we'll kind of pick up the conversation from there. Because, I think that in the original part 2 that we had recorded, we spent a long time kind of going back and forth. And I proposed something, he didn't like it. I was explaining why you really have to do it. And then, we kind of arrived at a mutually agreeable next step. And to give you a hint as to what that is, Nesto is much more productive than his associate. And Nesto's associate, remember in the story, when Nesto's associate came in to the picture, that's when the financial stress started mounting. So those are your clues as to what was my observation and how we started part 2. And we're going to get back to that next episode. So this is probably the most unconventional Practice Underwater Part 1 I've ever recorded, but just think about it from my perspective. Like, we've recorded it twice now. I don't want to record it a third time. Nesto has been very generous with his time with us at Shared Practices, but I also want to make sure that we're being efficient with his time. So I think that, you've kind of gotten to know Nesto's story, how Nesto ended up with these 2 practices, how I came to know Nesto with the Ask George Mastermind, and also my original advice to him with the 3 different options, him picking option 3, then keeping both practices, coming back on air and kind of just diving into the situation. And I think the thing that I really want to say is, we record Practice Underwater because Nesto's name is not Nesto. He has a different name. But we call him Nesto. You have no idea where he lives. And probably only his business partner is going to really pick up on what this is, and former business partner. And so we just get to talk openly about what maybe multiple people in the audience are experiencing, which is a challenging situation. And I know that I've had a challenging situation in ownership where I was working 4 days a week and losing money, and I know how brutal that is. And so, I think that that's why we have practice underwater, and I really appreciate the opportunity to get to talk about a grittier story. So I really appreciate Nesto for coming on and really just opening up with us and letting us talk about his scenario openly and have everyone learn from it, because I think there's a lot of learning lessons here, right? I think the one obvious learning lesson is the buyer's representation services element of this, right? It is crucial. The practice you purchase is such a big determinant of your success in your career if you're going the acquisition route. And just having so what we do at Shared Practices with the buyer's representation services is different than what an accountant would do, for example. So an accountant is going to look at the financials, right? So they would look at the $690,000 in collections. They'd look at the, all of that, and they would say like, okay, after you pay your debt, you're going to make this much money. But here's the problem with that practice and that way of looking at it is $690,000 is not replicable, right? So there needs to be a separate analysis, which is what is the patient flow driven demand in this practice? And that's what buyer's representation services does, right? And so buyer's representation services, we would have been able to very clearly identify that practice 2, the one that he purchased second with 7 hygiene days, was actually much better than the first. And so if Nesto had come to us in buyer's representation services, we would have said, proceed with 1 office, not the second. Go for that 7 hygiene day per week and have 1 practice, right? And then that's probably would have been our advice. But, that being said, and I don't want to belabor this point because Nesto owns both practices, but I just think for everyone else who's learning, going from 1 to 2 practices, you really got to make sure that the second one has strong fundamentals for success, or else you could end up in the same type of scenario. But then also as a pre-owner going into your first practice, you don't want to have your only practice be a slower practice and then you're not generating your income. You're not taking advantage of those years of your career. So it's just super important when you're buying a practice to measure twice and cut once. And so, I really appreciate Nesto for coming on. And I remember when we talked on the Mastermind, he was like, I probably should have used buyer's representation services here. And then he kind of told the story. And so I think he's self-identified that. But nonetheless, we're here to help him. And so next week, or whenever this part 2 is released, we're going to have Nesto on the podcast with me. And we'll kind of go through that key observation that I made. I'll briefly kind of talk about what I originally suggested, what we ended up agreeing on. And then, I really want to check in with Nesto to see really what is happening now. And has he made those changes that we talked about, or is he still waiting? And then that'll kind of kick off part 2. So appreciate you guys for listening to this episode. And sorry we weren't able to get Nesto on. We all tried very hard to get Nesto on for part 1, and it just wasn't in the cards. So we'll have him on next time for part 2 of Practice Underwater. And thank you for listening again to another episode of the Shared Practices podcast.